Good evening. I'm Julie James, Vice President of the Filson Historical Society, and I'm so glad you joined us for tonight's presentation, Voices from the Peace Corps, 50 Years of Kentucky Volunteers with Angene and Jack Wilson. Angene and Jack Wilson were Peace Corps volunteers in Liberia from 1962 to 1964, and later lived as a family in Sierra Leone, 1966 through 1968. And Fiji from 1970 to 1972. After Jack joined the Peace Corps staff, Angene was a professor for more than 30 years at the University of Kentucky. Jack was an administrator of environmental protection programs for the Commonwealth. They are co-authors of Voices of African Immigrants in Kentucky, Migration, Identity, and Transnationality. After the presentation, I will return to moderate questions as time permits. For now, please join me in welcoming Angene and Jack Wilson. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, but before we begin, we would like to ask the audience to answer a couple of questions in the chat so that we know who you all are. Are any of you returned Peace Corps volunteers? If you are, please indicate the country and the years you were a volunteer. And the second question, which requires only a yes, is do any of you have friends, spouses, children, or other relatives who have been Peace Corps volunteers? Now for our presentation, let me explain how we will go about it. First, we'll describe how and why we wrote the book. Second, we will each read excerpts in our book from 5 oral history interviews of Peace Corps volunteers. Because they are good stories, and because of events in the last 8 months, we chose 2 volunteers who served as teacher trainers in Ukraine in the early 2000s, and a volunteer who worked on a vaccination campaign in Afghanistan from 1969 to 71. The 4th volunteer was a public administrator in Liberia from 1965 to 67, and the 5th, the primary school teacher in Liberia from 1964 to 67. Third, we will talk a bit about Peace Corps today, because we have been active in the Kentucky Peace Corps Association and the National Peace Corps Association for almost 25 years. We can share some of the news about what's going on with Peace Corps now. And then, of course, we will leave plenty of time for questions from you.
Although we applied to become Peace Corps volunteers in March of 1961, when we were seniors in college and Peace Corps began, and then we served in the first group in Liberia from 1962 to 64, we know volunteers from all decades, and we knew they would have stories to tell. So we thought it would be interesting to interview them and hear their stories. Jack had retired from leading the Division of Water for Kentucky State Government, and I was a professor at the University of Kentucky and was about to retire. So we went to Terry Birdwhistle, who was then the director of the Nunn Oral History Center at the University of Kentucky. And we said, you have interviews of governors and sports figures and Black ministers and just all kinds of interviews, but you don't have any of Peace Corps volunteers. What about if we did that? We interviewed Peace Corps volunteers, what we call returned Peace Corps volunteers. And he said, do it, gave us recorders, showed us the process, and assigned student workers to transcribe the interviews. We had a wonderful time interviewing 84 volunteers from all decades who had served in 52 countries from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. At the time we were interviewing, the Peace Corps was active in 76 countries and had been active in 63 others. Although Kentucky was our geographic touchstone, and the interviewees were here now at that point, they were born or grew up in 28 other states and 5 other countries. Most of the interviews are available to read and listen to, and the link is in the chat. In the last several years, about 600 more interviews have been done of and by other returned volunteers, including a special collection of the volunteers who had to be evacuated just 2 years ago because of COVID, March of 2020. The Nunn Center, which is a national and now international leader in oral history, is now officially the home of the larger Peace Corps collection, which continues to grow. After we completed most of our interviews, Terry Birdwhistle, who was also on the board of the University Press of Kentucky and an editor of their series entitled Kentucky Remembered, suggested that we write a book. So we did. We chose to organize the chapters chronologically through the entire Peace Corps experience and use illustrative excerpts from the interviews. So the first chapter is why we went. The second is getting in, and the third is training. The chapters that deal with being in country are the toughest, job you'll ever love, telling stories, and friends can become family. Our life after Peace Corps is in chapters entitled Coming Home, Making a Difference, and Citizens of the World for the Rest of Our Lives. No one volunteer's complete experience is included in the book, although excerpts from interviews of the same 6 volunteers who served in 5 different decades in Turkey, Philippines, Liberia, Jamaica, and China begin each chapter. The epilogue of the book is our story. Now listen to stories from 5 volunteers.
Winnie Younker, who just died on March 9th at age 87, applied to the Peace Corps as she was completing many years as assistant to the president of Sargent and Greenleaf Lock Manufacturer in Nicholasville, Kentucky. And she had completed a master's degree in international commerce at UK's Patterson School of Diplomacy. She described the process of getting in. The application was online and very simplified, about 10 pages. The medical application was about 15 pages, and I really had to outline everything, my 60-odd years of life. 3 references wrote secret letters. I had to send them sealed to the Peace Corps, so I have no idea what they wrote about me. And I had to write an essay about why I wanted to be in the Peace Corps. I had 2 interviews, but what surprised me was they were both telephonic. Chicago is the nearest office for Peace Corps recruiters, and the Peace Corps interested in cost cutting didn't require personal interviews if you were a certain number of miles away. So the first one was sort of general. I remember one of the questions was, what if you are sent to a Muslim country? And I said, well, I know that I might have to wear a dress, and I don't do that. I mostly wear jeans. In fact, I wear pants to church, but I guess I could adapt. They arranged another interview about a month later. Each one lasted about an hour. Just questions. So at the end, the interviewer said to me that he was going to recommend me for acceptance. After Winnie convinced a dentist to pull 3 teeth because she didn't have the money to have new caps put on, which Peace Corps medical folks required, she left. She retired on January 20th, 2000, and left for staging in Chicago on January 31st. On February 2nd, she arrived in Ukraine, and that, she said, was the worst winter of the 3 she was there. She taught business in Ukraine. And Zoya Rodnova hosted Winnie from 2000 to 2002 in her home. She was also a teacher at the same school, and they became best friends. She knew everything. She was 48. She'd been around. She'd lived under communism. In fact, her husband had been an officer in the Communist Party. But the minute the country went independent in 1991, and the new president said, Ukraine is our language, not Russian, Zoa's father, who had been in the KGB and the Communist Party and was a colonel, told his family, we're speaking Ukrainian from this moment on. All of my friends felt that way too. Later, Zoa helped Winnie organize a Christmas party for children in a local orphanage. And after Winnie left Ukraine and came home, she continued to send money to help support the orphanage. Winnie said, the thing she does with that money for those orphans is just amazing.
Peg Dixon was in the same group and served as a teacher trainer. She described their training in Cherkasy, 3 hours of language training and 3 to 4 hours of technical training every day, and also described living with a host family. Living with a family was memorable because it really involved us in family life and got us used to how Ukrainians did things as opposed to how Americans do things. After the first couple of days, I went into the kitchen to help my host mother, who was a couple years younger than I am, fix dinner. She sat me down with a pan of potatoes, none of them bigger than a large golf ball, and a knife close to 12 inches long. She probably thought I was totally incompetent, but I had never peeled potatoes with a knife that big. The first morning, I was presented with a big, thick sausage, like a giant hot dog, and a pile of plain spaghetti for breakfast. It was my introduction to you aren't in Kansas anymore. We got used to the food and the customs, such as the way people relate to each other. Ukrainians don't smile, and if you walk down the street with a smile on your face, they think you're crazy. Their history has not been nearly as pleasant as ours, so they don't have much to smile about. My mother was a good mother. She would sit me down every night and help me with my Ukrainian homework and make sure I did it. For the host families, this was a way to make some extra money, and they also wanted their Peace Corps volunteers to be successful. Peg also describes May 9th, a huge holiday in Ukraine called Victory Day. It's the end of World War II for the Ukrainians and the Soviet Union, the victory in Europe. On my first Victory Day in Ukraine, I went with one of the teachers. There was a parade with Soviet flags flying because, of course, they fought under the Soviet flags. The parade ended up at the Eternal Flame in the city, where there was a memorial to World War II veterans and victims, and everybody laid flowers on the flame until it was just mounded. There was a military ceremony, and at the end of that, we went back to her apartment for a meal together. She and her husband lived with her father-in-law, who had been a colonel in the Soviet Army at the end of World War II. He was in his 90s when I met him, and he had on his full Soviet military uniform for Victory Day. I have a picture of him. And through my friend who interpreted, because he didn't speak any English and I couldn't understand all of his Russian, he told me about Victory Day. The Soviet troops couldn't celebrate until they knew that Stalin had gotten word of the German defeat and the acceptance of that. So they celebrated on May 9th. He also told how when they got to Berlin and met the American troops shared their canned meat with the Soviet troops. That was the first meat they had had during the war. An American officer loaned him his Chevrolet to drive from Berlin back to Kermensky to pick up his wife and daughter because he was stationed in Berlin for a year. I was at the table with his daughter, who had ridden in that American Chevrolet.
Charlene Mcgrath was part of an all-female group whose mission was to vaccinate women against smallpox in Afghanistan from 1969 to 71. She described the special program. We were identified with the Ministry of Health, and two Peace Corps volunteer girls would go with 6 or 7 young men who were under the supervision of an older man who might have had a 9th grade education. They would bundle us into Land Rovers and drop us off in various rural areas for a month, or 6 weeks, or 2 months. We did a lot of outbreak containment work because there was still active smallpox at that time in Afghanistan. We did some epidemiological work too. We used Russian freeze-dried vaccines, bifurcated needles, and we had several Russian doctors working with us. A bifurcated needle looks like a devil's pitchfork, except it has only 2 prongs. You get a drop of vaccine between the prongs, and then you rub it on the person's arm and stick them at least 20 times, and they are vaccinated. We also included in the Friends Can Become Family chapter the following wonderful story that Charlene told at a returned Peace Corps volunteer gathering in 2009. In 1970, I met Muhammad Alam Baluch. My fiance, Mike, was a Peace Corps English teacher stationed in Kang, a small village near the Iranian-Afghan border. There he met Alam, who was several years older and from a prominent family. Mike moved to Kabul in 1970, and Alam, who was attending Kabul University at the time, was a frequent guest in his home. I was there quite often and enjoyed drinking coffee and talking with Alam. In fact, when Mike went on home leave for a month because he was extending for a year, Alam would come over for a cup of coffee and a visit. He didn't want me to be sad because I was alone. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, he moved his family to Zabul, Iran, and from time to time, he would send us items made by his family and ask us to market them for him. Of course, we kept them and sent Alam the money. We lost track of Alam probably in the early 1990s. Then in early 2005, I received an email from Alam's nephew who had worked as a translator for American troops in Afghanistan, asking if I was the Charlene Keelan from North Carolina who had nicknamed her mother Gray Mouse. He told me that Alam was living in Kabul with his family and wondered how Mike and I were doing and if we had children. I emailed back saying that Mike was deceased and that we had 2 daughters and the elder was getting married soon. In the fall of 2005, after my daughter's wedding in June, I moved to northern Kentucky. I had sold my home in Jackson and returned to close on the house. I drove on to Hazard to see friends I had worked with there and was very surprised to see a package waiting for me. I opened the box and immediately burst into tears. Alam had sent from Afghanistan a wedding dress for my daughter made of white silk covered with gold embroidery. He had sent a 2-piece, lovely dark green silk outfit for my younger daughter, and he sent me just a gorgeous mother of the bride dress made of white and pink silk with lots of gold embroidery. I was just overwhelmed. I had not spoken to Alam since I left Afghanistan in 1971. And yet, he treated me like a family member. Mike was his brother, his good friend, and Alam wanted to be sure his friend's wife and children had wedding clothes. I was touched. The act of generosity just meant so much to me and my family, and it typifies the way Afghans are. They give you everything, whether they have a little or a lot. They are open-hearted and welcoming.
Older volunteers served in Peace Corps like Winnie and Peg, and young volunteers like Charlene served and sometimes met and married another volunteer as Charlene did. And I do see in the chat that there are a couple of you who have been volunteers or have a sister who served. And in both of those cases, I think it was in the 60s. And for the last reading, we're going to introduce you to 2 volunteers who served in the 60s. Their names are Tom and Susan Samuel. In the Why We Went chapter, which is the first chapter, we quote Tom as saying, Kennedy was killed and it seemed like a good idea to go into the Peace Corps. In fact, the week after Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, that was the all-time record of applications received, 2,550. And the most volunteers that have ever served in 1966, which was 16,000. Actually, Kennedy would like to have seen 100,000 volunteers serve. Tom recalled good training at San Francisco University. In the 60s, when Peace Corps began, training was done at universities. In the late 60s, transitioned to happening in country, and now, of course, does happen in the countries. Tom remembered his training and described one of the activities. He was sent out with $20 and seeing what you could learn about Castroville, remember this is in California, in 5 days. Tom met the president of the Mexican Americans for Political Action, MAPA, and he went out to the field to see artichokes being picked. Then he met the mayor, got his picture in the paper, and spoke before a civic group about Peace Corps. I walked away knowing a lot about Castroville and a lot about what it takes to be immersed in a community and really get to know it. I found out the post office is an important place to go because the postmaster has certain ties to the community. Got to know the mayor, MAPPA, the volunteer fire folks. I think immersion in another culture is a kind of growth experience you can't replicate. And of course, those of us who became Peace Corps volunteers discovered that too, being there for 2 years. Then later, under telling stories, that chapter, Tom talks about his flight from the capital of Monrovia to Buchanan, a town down the Atlantic coast, where he was assigned to work as a public administrator. I got a taxi and went out to the airport. There were wings and engines and propellers, but no whole airplane that I could see. Finally, we came to a whole airplane, but there were parts lying all around, which did not lead to great confidence that this was a good idea. But the taxi driver said, "This is where you belong." He dropped me off in my luggage and I walked into this little shack and the guy says, "You're going to Buchanan today, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I hope so." He said, "Get your stuff, let's go. And don't step on this wing or the tail section." So we're going down the runway full blast and he puts on the brakes. "Oh, no gas," he says. So we go back and get gas and take off and we're going down the coast and he says, "Did you ever see sea turtles?" And I said, "No." And suddenly we're on the water looking at sea turtles and we go inland a way so he can show me a wrecked plane. And I say, "Can we get back to the coast, please?" By this time I have my imprint on the little handle in front of me on this plane. We get to Buchanan and he flies over the town a couple times and then lands on a grass strip. He says, "Okay, they'll be out to pick you up." I say, "Who is they?" Because there's nobody, there's nothing there. Finally, somebody did come to pick me up, and it was Susan, whom I married a year later. And now, in Friends Can Become Family, their story, she tells her story. She says, Tom visited friends in Monrovia several times after his arrival on Liberia's Atlantic coast. In October, he invited those friends to Buchanan for Liberian Thanksgiving, the first weekend of November. However, he needed someone to cook the turkey. And so Susan continues this story. He took me to the movies one night and asked if I could cook. And I said, sure. So that was his first Thanksgiving with me. I was away during the school holidays then around Christmas and visited a friend. I said to her, this guy is going to ask me to marry him. Should I do it? I didn't really come to any conclusion, but I got off the airplane in Buchanan, and that night he proposed down on one knee. Such a sweetie. We got married April 16th and had 125 people at our wedding at the Catholic Church. The audience was probably 60% Peace Corps and 40% Liberians, all people I taught with. My bridesmaids were all from Peace Corps. I was a little late getting to the church, and the shoeshine boy came by and saw all those people sitting there in the church and thought it was a great opportunity. I weighed about 95 pounds and had a little short white linen dress that somebody made for me with a beautiful white lace over top that buttoned down the back with those teensy-weensy buttons and long sleeves, all lace, so it was cool and comfortable. My headpiece looked like a donut with some veil coming out of it. The wedding rings didn't come. One of my professors at San Diego State, who was a jeweler, had made them out of ivory and silver. So the night before we got married, I went down to the local market and bought some plastic earrings that were bendable. We just coiled them around. He got one and I got the other. Father Patrick Jewell blessed 2 sets. The San Diego ones came later and asked if there would be any more. Our cake was a gift from the people who owned the bar in town, but it had come by road 100 miles from a bakery in Monrovia, and some of the chocolate had dripped in the heat, looking like chocolate icicles. We had champagne and cake, $100 for the whole thing, and then I extended for an extra year. In the book are 2 pictures of Tom and Susan's wedding. It was officiated by the first ordained Liberian Catholic priest. We visited Tom and Susan 2 weeks ago in Memphis, where they now live with their daughter, and son-in-law, who were also Peace Corps volunteers in Namibia and in Bolivia. They are a real Peace Corps family. Their younger daughter served in Turkmenistan, and Tom also served about 10 years ago as a Peace Corps response volunteer. That's another way that one can serve after one's served as a volunteer. He was in the Gambia helping develop a university curriculum in public health.
Finally, what is happening with Peace Corps right now? We are members of the Shriver Circle of the National Peace Corps Association, which meets the first week of March each year to do advocacy in Congress and to learn about current issues affecting the Peace Corps. For the last 2 years, those meetings have been on Zoom. So we will describe briefly what is happening with the Peace Corps and the National Peace Corps Association right now. The most important thing is that Peace Corps is returning to 24 countries from this month on. In fact, some of you might have seen a piece the end of last week on NBC about the first returnees. In all 62 countries which had volunteers before COVID want volunteers back. First, volunteers are going to the Dominican Republic and Zambia right now. Then on a rolling basis to 22 more countries: Belize, Benin, Colombia, Costa Rica, East Caribbean, Ecuador, Ghana, Kenya, Kosovo, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Namibia, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Rwanda, South Africa, Senegal, Sierra Leone, South Africa, the Gambia, and Uganda. Perhaps some of you saw that piece, and it showed a real sensitivity, I think, about returning volunteers. We've also met recently Olivia, one of 3 new volunteers, all graduates of Transylvania University here in Lexington. They will be leaving for the Gambia in West Africa on June 5th. When we learned that Olivia writes poetry, we lent her a book of poetry by a Gambian who graduated from Berea College, as well as some other books from the 6 shelves of African books in our basement.
We are writing letters to President Biden right now and our senators about the 2023 budget, trying to raise what has been a flat $410.5 million for the budget for about 7 years to $450 million, which would support 10,000 volunteers instead of the 7,000 that Peace Corps has been stuck at for decades. It's true that both Presidents Bush and Obama were in favor of going to 10,000, but the budget had to have enough money in it to do that. The Peace Corps Reauthorization Act will be introduced by Senator Mendez in the Senate soon, and that includes other items like permission to use the Peace Corps logo on gravestones and death notices. You'll notice that some of us are getting a little bit old and maybe ready for that. And it also extends insurance after volunteers return and a number of other things. Peace Corps, with input from National Peace Corps Association, has done a deep dive into important issues like sexual assault and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's really been changing itself in the 2 COVID years when there were only staff in the countries. Finally, watch for the film A Towering Task, A History of the Peace Corps, which is going to be shown on PBS near the end of the year. It's a terrific movie. We've seen it both online and in person at the Grand Theater in Frankfurt. But it has been a towering task itself, which has just been completed, to raise the money to show the film, a towering task, on PBS. So now we're glad to begin to answer some of your questions.
Angene and Jack, thank you so much. It sounds like you've had such wonderful experiences and made so many friends with throughout your service with the Peace Corps. So we'll start with the first question from Judith. She wants to know, what are some of the hardest aspects of transitioning back to one's home country when the Peace Corps assignment is completed?
That is a really good question. And
The aisles of dog food, I would say.
we have a whole chapter entitled Coming Home. And some people would say that re-entry is harder than entry, because it really is tough. Staying in the same community for 2 years, you've made a lot of friends, you've really adjusted to another culture, and coming home can be hard. I think it's a little bit different now than it was when we were there. And I sort of hesitate to say that because we always are people who say, when people say, oh, you served in the Peace Corps in the 1960s, when of course we didn't talk on the phone to our parents for 2 years. But nevertheless, I think that while the aisles at the grocery stores are different, volunteers today can easily keep in touch with their families and with friends, most of them, because most volunteers have cell phones and so forth. But what Jack just mentioned was something that a lot of volunteers say, just the amount of stuff we have.
That's available.
Yeah.
And you can be, some people, when they come back into it, are just overwhelmed because they've been living where that doesn't exist for the most part.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit more about the qualifications for becoming a Peace Corps volunteer, and about the jobs that they have to do, and maybe a little bit about how that has changed over time?
You have to be 18 years old, but in reality, most people, we have a couple people in the book who were younger. Most people have a college degree. And we didn't tell you about this from Winnie Younker, but Winnie Younker was living in Washington, D.C. when Peace Corps started. And she actually went to the Peace Corps office and said, I want to be a Peace Corps volunteer. And they said, you've got to have a degree. So
then she came back to Kentucky and, had a life for 40 years.
Right.
And then joined. And Peg Dixon was to some extent that way. Had early desires to be a part of Peace Corps, and waited till much later in life to do so. But Angene is right. The common age today, I think, would be in the 20s.
Yeah, we had in our group, we had had a couple of older volunteers who were in 50s, 60s, and 30s, but a lot of us were young. We'd been married a year, but we had people who didn't have a honeymoon, got married right before they left. And our group was an interesting one because they weren't sure how couples were going to work. And so our group, actually, there were about 95 of us, and we had 11 married couples. And so 5 of us are still married and 6 aren't. So it's,
which is about typical for the US.
Right.
In terms of jobs, I suppose the most common and consistent over the 50, 60 years have been in education. And both primary and secondary education. We were both secondary school teachers. There are some who've done teacher training. And then more recently, we've had volunteers in environmental programs. Some of the early volunteers were in agriculture. When I was director in Fiji, we had a cooperative program where volunteers came and helped organize cooperatives. In fact, the tapestry on the corner behind Angene's head was one that came from a craft cooperative in Fiji. The other thing I would say, and many people don't know this, but there was a time in the very early 70s when Peace Corps recruited individuals for highly trained individuals, and in some cases families. So for example, I had in Fiji a physics professor who had been a physics professor at Harvard, who came to teach at the University of the South Pacific, and he had 3 children maybe with him. And then single skill kinds of things. I also programmed there a prosthesist, someone who could build artificial limbs. And that was not something that a small country like Fiji had ever had or could have. And I believe his wife was in special education. So there's a wide range of job opportunities in this one.
We haven't mentioned health, and that's very important. In the 90s, 2000s, every volunteer who served in an African country worked on HIV/AIDS projects. Volunteers, generally speaking, have what's called a secondary project, and so they, besides teaching school or working in agriculture, one of the things that's been done in agriculture in, for example, Zambia and DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, which used to be Zaire, is fish ponds, right?
Yeah.
And in Latin America, there were lots of volunteers who worked in community development. That was a big thing at the beginning. So there are various opportunities, and any of you who are interested, and you can go at any age. I mean, Lillian Carter, Jimmy Carter's mother, was a Peace Corps volunteer in India. But do Google peacecorps.gov, because one of the things that's really kind of interesting and exciting is that during COVID, they did, and they're still doing that. You can be a virtual volunteer. They were people who had been in country and working with a particular project continued to work with that project. And then there's this Peace Corps response, which is volunteers going back and filling individual sort of like what happened in the early 70s, right? Individual jobs that,
more highly trained
yeah.
and
Right.
experienced than the average 20-year-old volunteer.
So I think we should make the point that most of us have thought that the training that Peace Corps has done has been incredible. The language training, and of course it can always be improved. Cross-cultural training, but that, what do you say about training, about our training? Don't you say that it was worth a year in college?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
I
no, it's
said
just
that
incredible.
easily.
Yeah, what we have. Yeah, right.
Great. So can you talk to us a little bit about how Peace Corps volunteers changed your own lives?
Well, I would say for me, it gave me what I have done for the rest of my life. Because I was teaching history, social studies in Liberia. And I began to learn with my students African history. My students had, generally speaking, been using books from the US. I mean, Liberia has a connection. If you don't know the history, there's interesting history with Liberia and Kentucky. We began to learn African history. I came back and got a master's in African Studies, African History at Michigan State, and then went on and got a doctorate in humanities education at Ohio State. But I, for the rest of my life, I've been trying to teach people about Africa. I wrote a book in the Peace Corps Writers Series, which you can get on Amazon, which is entitled Africa on My Mind, 50 years of following the third goal, because the third goal of Peace Corps is to bring the world back home. And so that's what I've done ever since, for almost 60 years now. And the other thing I would say, and maybe Jack can pick up on that, is the friends that we've made, not just Peace Corps volunteers, but many, many friends, Liberian friends and other African friends.
Yeah, I guess in my case, I would say I never used the master's degree that I got afterwards. We left in the middle of that degree. I went back and finished it with a cynical view that nobody would ever ask what it was in. They'd just pay me a couple $1,000s more a year for those two initials. And I think that was true for the most part. And I spent my career really in public service for a nonprofit educational association in Cleveland, Ohio. When we came back, the years I spent as a Peace Corps staff person, when we came back in the 70s, the next good cause was the environment, and the Ohio EPA was just being formed. And so I took an administrative job there and followed that through Ohio and then here in Kentucky until retired. But
Oh, no, that's all right. We'll let them go to another question.
So what advice would you give to people that are joining the Peace Corps as a volunteer or thinking about it? What advice would you give them?
Well, I'll let Jack talk about one example of the person who wrote that letter, remember? But before that, I think that the most important thing is that you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn an awful lot. And so you've got to be the kind of person who is very curious and who is has a high level of tolerance for ambiguity because
And failure.
because you're not going to know what people are saying sometimes. I mean, even if you're learning another language, you're not going to understand. So if you're curious and you have a tolerance for ambiguity, and you just you like, I think it's important to like people, because at least for us, the people that we have gotten to know, and then it's meant that we've gotten to know more people. When I am with my friend who I was with yesterday, who is well, because we were young, she's only 6 years younger than we are. And she was one of my students, and she now lives in Lexington, Kentucky. Now, there are lots of African immigrants in Kentucky, and lots of people from Liberia. And so when we're out together and somebody says, well, so how do you know each other? I'll say, well, she's the person in Lexington who I have known the longest. She came here after the war in 2003. She's a US citizen, but our families are intertwined. So that's I guess what I would say.
Well, and I think it has, we have followed through, in a sense, our international interests on everything from helping with entertain international students at the university, to going to their countries after we have retired, to learn something more. In one case, South Africa, we have tried to be supportive of international students, and the world is just bigger after you have been a Peace Corps volunteer.
So you were asking what would make somebody, I guess, successful, and we went off on ourselves. But I think that really, it's just you have to be open to what the experience is going to bring, and not take ideas of this is what I'm going to do. I mean, you don't want to be, and that is a problem sometimes. You don't want to be a white savior going into Black Africa, for example, or any place else for that matter. You are expected to do something. You're not just there not to do anything. But Americans are very focused on doing. And sometimes you've got to remember, well, I've got there are three objectives of Peace Corps. One is to bring some kind of skill to the country, teaching or health or whatever it is. But the second is to let people in other countries know what Americans are really like. And the third is to bring the world back home. So you want to be somebody who's willing to do all three of those. Right.
So Dennis made a comment in the chat, but that if he was a little bit younger, he'd have an interest in doing this. But you referenced that really age is not so much of a factor. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the oldest volunteer a couple of years ago was 86.
Oh, okay.
The only thing that gets in the way of older volunteers, quite frankly, is health. And Peace Corps has always been very hard-nosed about health. I referred in one reading here about Winnie, the dentist saying, you have to have those teeth capped because Peace Corps said so. And she said, what if I have them pulled? And she got them pulled. took her a long time to find a dentist who would do it, but she said, I can't afford the thousands of dollars to cap 3 teeth before I go.
Well, and another older volunteer who had problems with alcohol thought they weren't going to let him go, and he said, I've been, I've beaten that, and so
he appealed it all the way
to the top,
to the director,
and his story is in the book.
So another one of the people that are joining us tonight, Rose Nett, has talked about her incredible experience and what a mind-opening experience that that she had. So I'm just curious, Angene and Jack, this is kind of your last question, but what's your next adventure?
Well, I don't know.
Our adventures are probably closer to home now because of some health issues. And somebody asked us what our next book was going to be, because we have written this book, Voices of African Immigrants, which is a wonderful thing to do too. We just got back from going to see our daughter in Dallas, and then going to Louisiana and going to the Whitney plantation, and then driving back up the Mississippi Delta, and that was a wonderful trip. And so we haven't given up, but we're not. There are a lot of people going back to Liberia to celebrate the 60th in October, and we're not doing that. But we're paying for our Liberian friend I just talked about to go back next week for her sister's funeral. So, we sort of find some other ways.
And we
do that.
have long said when we were traveling overseas, well, when we get old, we can see more of the United States. And that's probably what our adventures will be from now on.
Well, wonderful. And thank you so much for tonight's presentation. And I wish you safe travels, and thanks to all for joining us this evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.